Hello and welcome to DX Frontend Bootcamp 1.0. Today we are going to be learning how the internet works. My name is Israel from Xeraxlabs and I'm going to be your instructor for today. First, it is important we understand what exactly is a website. Well, a website is a simple collection of web pages which are just regular code that describes the format, layout, and contents on a browser. But let us see what quickly happens behind the screen whenever we enter the web address inside of our browser. Now, what happens behind the scene is this. Our browser is going to send a request to a remote server somewhere, and that server is going to send a response back to our browser. And that browser is now going to read and interpret that particular response that it has received, and it's now going to render an output. Now, you're going to notice we used client here and we used server on the other side. Now, what exactly is a server? What exactly is a client? Well, a server is just a simple computer that is connected over the internet that has resources readily available to serve. And this particular server also has an IP address. Well, you might want to ask, what is an IP address? We are going to come there in a bit. On the other hand, what exactly is a client? Well, for most part, a client is referred to as a particular web accessing software that is located on a web user's system that is connected to the internet. It's simply big English, but for sometimes you could also refer to a client as a system or a phone connected over the internet. Well, let's quickly look at what happens behind the scene when we enter a domain name right inside of our browser. But before then, let us quickly explain what exactly is a domain name. Well, a domain name is just a simple name that represents an IP address or multiple IP addresses. Now, what exactly is an IP address? Well, an IP address looks exactly as this. It is just a simple numeric identifier that references a domain name. So they are used interwovenly. This is a domain name, and this is exactly what an IP address looks like. So when you are visiting facebook.com, what is actually happening is this. Your browser is going to send a request over to your internet service provider, which is an ISP. Well, we are using a lot of terms right inside of this presentation, but you are going to get to understand them as we proceed in this course. Do you need to really cram all this? The big answer is no. You only need to understand how the internet works so that it's going to make you a good developer on your own. Now, when we send this particular address, which is our domain name, over to the ISP, it returns an IP address. Now, this IP address is what our browser now sends through our internet service provider, and then we want to locate that particular server that has this IP address. And once we are able to locate that particular server, the server is going to pull back a response through our internet service provider that is then going to be rendered on the page. Now, this response is going to consist of a message and a few files. Now, an example of those files are HTML files, CSS, and JavaScript files. Now, these files, what exactly are they? Well, HTML is just a markup language that determines the layout of your web page, while the CSS determines the design that is going to be applied to that particular layout. And JavaScript is just right there in order to add functionality to your web page. Now, these files are going to be served right back at your browser. Your browser is going to interpret these files into a beautiful outlook that you are going to be seeing. Now, let us quickly dive into discussing the lot of terms that we have used inside of this presentation. Now, the first one is the client. What exactly is a client? Just as discussed earlier, a client is simply placed as typical internet connected device. It could be your phone, or it could be your laptop that is connected over a Wi-Fi or a mobile connection. And for sometimes it is referred to as a simple web accessing software that is available on this particular device. Well, a lot of big grammar, but what it simply means is, for the most part, sometimes we refer to client as just our particular web browsers like Chrome or Firefox. Right next, we're going to be talking about what exactly is a server. Well, a server is a computer connected to the internet that has resources readily available to be served. Next, we are going to look at what exactly is a domain name. Just like we have seen, an example of a domain name is facebook.com. Well, it is simply just a name that is used to identify one or more IP addresses. And we're going to be touching those guys in a bit. Well, what then is an IP address? Just like we have discussed, an IP address is just a numerical identifier for a particular device. And that device could be a server, a computer, a printer, or a router. Now, we are going to be looking at common case scenarios and what exactly we can do with these IP addresses. You're going to see that you can access a particular server or a remote resource by either using the domain name or using the IP addresses. But you're going to see that for the most part, this guy is going to be difficult memorizing. Imagine if I have to memorize 10 websites and then I have to cram all these numbers word for word. But a domain name makes it easier in order to reference this particular IP address or multiple IP addresses. So it's going to be easier to call facebook.com than having to memorize 102.131.101.35. And we are going to be seeing it working live in a moment. In order to fully understand how the web works, we are now going to dive into doing the practicals of all the theories that we have learned. Let's say I want to visit a web address now. I'm going to type in the domain name here. And the web address I want to visit is facebook.com. So if I type in right there, facebook.com, and I press enter in my web browser, it is automatically going to take me to facebook.com. But there's something happening behind the scene here. This is actually going to fetch the IP address that is pertaining to facebook.com, and that is what is being served for me to see. So this actually domain name here is covering the ugly looking IP address that I should have been saying. But what if I want to visit the IP address? Quickly, let's do something now. I'm just going to do Window R on my keyboard and then type in CMD. When I do that, I'm going to be greeted with this ugly screen right here. Do you need to learn how to do this? Well, the answer is just no. But we want to quickly get the IP address of facebook.com so we could be able to visit that so you could see it. In order to do that, all I need to do is do something called ping and just say facebook.com. And when I do that, it is going to ping facebook.com and reply with a few bytes. And from here, I can easily see the IP address of facebook.com. So I'm just going to copy this particular IP address, a light bulb, then press Ctrl C on my keyboard. And if I come here, you're going to notice what is going to happen. Notice in this new bar now, I'm not memorizing. Oops, that has been something copied from previous time. So let's go back there and try copying that guy. So I'm just going to select this and then try copy it this time. So it seems it's copied. Okay. So I'm just going to come right here and paste this IP address down. So imagine having to memorize this guy to visit just the Facebook site. It's going to be boring. Let's press enter and see what is served to us. You could see that IP address automatically still brought us back to facebook.com. So that is how this works. So when you enter a domain name, what is happening in the back is that is transferred to your internet service provider, which in turn does a domain name lookup and returns back the particular IP address that is pertaining to this domain name that you have entered. And then your browser sends a request to that server through your ISP, and static files along with the response is served to your browser, and that is what is being rendered to your screen. So that is all for the physical part. Let us do something more interesting. Right next is an internet service provider. Now remember, we said when you make a request from your browser, it is first going to channel it through your internet service provider, which is then going to make a DNS lookup of that particular domain name that you have given, and it's going to send back an IP address. The internet service provider is just an organization that provides services for accessing the internet. An example of those could be MTN, Glo for Nigerians, or it could be Verizon or Sprint for people in other countries. Well, let's look at what then is a domain name system. If you look at our previous presentation, you're going to see that a domain name system is just a simple decentralized database or address book that converts domain name into their corresponding IP address. In other terms, it is just like walking into a library and then you have you're seeing a lot of books on the shelf, but you only want the librarian to be able to give you recommendations to where and which shelf a particular book is located. So the DNS automatically handles this and returns back the IP address back to the ISP, which in turn sends it back to the browser that sends that request down over to the particular server in question. You must have had certain questions or might have come across these particular terms somewhere: front end and back end. The front end, usually sometimes called the client side, is simply just parts that users interact with directly on a web page. And this can include like buttons, they can include images, they can include other sections on our web page. But for the back end, this is sometimes referred to as the server side of a website, and it is just the parts that a user cannot see directly, but it can store and arrange data in order to help and aid more functionality to the front end. Well, now that we have talked about front end, back end, we've talked about what exactly a website is and how the web works. Now that you know how the web works, it is important you know 5 little ways that we have chosen that is going to help you master the several concepts that we're going to be teaching in this bootcamp. One way is by practicing. By practicing, you help your brain to not only memorize a particular concept, but also understand them in details. Now, the second one is do not be afraid to break your code. By breaking your code, I mean by trying something new, by seeing other possible ways that one particular thing could actually work. When we show you a method, you can try other ways that are coming to your mind, or you are thinking that it is actually going to work. And when you try those things and they don't work, you seem to get even more better understanding of the particular program that you're working on. Now, as you watch the course, it is also important you ask personal questions. as you go through the series, it is important you ask yourself, why did this actually work? And what happened in my code that is actually not working? Now, the fourth way you could get the most out of this program is by seeking for help just as you encounter issues. When you try fixing the issues yourself and you can't really fix them, you should always ask for help. And one particular best way of doing that is by asking for help in the Slack channel. Me and other instructors are going to be ready available in order to help you with your issues that you encounter. Another way to get the most out of this program is by helping others. By helping others fix their bug, you are going to gain even a better experience, and you tend to notice that the more you help others, the more the particular code you've written sticks just right in your memory. Now, for the summary, it is important you know that a website is just a folder with some basic file that can be interpreted and rendered by the web browser. Now we have come to the end of this boring part of the section, and here with me I'm sharing a quote from Walt Disney. It says, "The way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing." Join me as we move right into the next section where we'll be setting up our dev environment.